Okay, so we are recording and thank you both for coming. So we're going to talk a little bit about, I'll start by saying that I'm hoping that this will be largely conversation based. I have some resources to share and some things to kind of just generally talk about. But I do have a couple of scenarios that I thought would be sort of fun for us to brainstorm our way through that are connected to the AI use and academic integrity stuff. So that's what I'm really hoping that we will get out of this. So here we go. Okay. So I'm going to start with just some general resources, some things that we have collected and some of the work that we've been doing here at SUNY Oswego. And then I have some sample case studies that I would like us to ponder that will likely be most of our discussion that we'll work through today. And then I will offer some additional resources and some strategies that we can consider as we start to wrap up at the end. Okay, so I wanted to start by highlighting several of the resources that we have begun collecting here on campus. So there are more than we have just listed here. I wanted to highlight some of the really big ones. And I also want to mention that all of these resources, like all of these different web pages, have a whole bunch more information that is built into them, so it's not just like one single page and then you're done. There's a lot of stuff that we have been working on and that we have been collecting. So let me go through. So Carol, I'm really glad that you're here, right? Because the first thing is thinking about the academic integrity policy in general. So I certainly don't want to put you on the spot, but I would like this to be discussion based. So I'm gonna click out of that for a second so that I can click on some links. Okay, yep. Carol, can I put you on the spot a little bit? Would you like to talk about the work that you and the other associate deans have been doing as you have updated this and, some of the things that you encountered as you were making changes to the academic integrity policy?
Sure. So just in broad strokes, the associate deans realized that the academic integrity policy that we had in our catalog wasn't kind of confused sort of policy and procedure and was inconsistently used and a bit cumbersome for faculty members to report academic integrity violations and for students to really, we felt, to understand clearly what the policy was all about and what procedural things, what due process in a sense. I mean, students don't really have due process, but what rights they have as students. So we undertook revamping, or not revamping, but refreshing the academic integrity policy. And of course, part of that then had to include the use of artificial intelligence. And because it's such a moving target, AI, when we started this revamp of the academic integrity policy, um, AI was just kind of starting out, or was just kind of something we were thinking about, or that was part of our classroom teaching. And now, there's different ways that it's being used. So we really couched academic integrity violations to encompass the use of AI, and primarily by the use of AI in an unauthorized or inappropriate way. And that really then brought the importance of how the campus and individual instructors really need to be very clear in their syllabus on what is appropriate use of AI for a particular class, whether some AI is okay and what that is, whether no AI use is okay, or how it has to be cited if students do use it. I mean, there's a whole variety of ways that instructors may choose to use AI for different assignments within the same class. And so it's just about being clear on that. And so if a student is violating the policy, then that's an academic integrity issue. And so that's how we brought in AI to the academic integrity policy. Is that enough detail, Stephanie, or is that?
That's wonderful. Thank you. Especially, since it was unexpected. So that was wonderful. And I'll say, kind of to piggyback off of that, I have found I can't remember exactly when the reporting process changed to what it is now. But I really like the new way of reporting. I find it really straightforward, super easy. It doesn't, it's not time consuming. And I found it to be a really productive way to kind of keep the communication open between what's happening in the classroom and reporting these sorts of violations to the dean's office. So
Right.
when did that
So that
change?
was a really big shift. We moved away from reporting academic integrity violations on Maxient, which goes through student conduct, and instead reported on Starfish, which gets then reported out to the associate deans. And so stays in academic affairs in a sense, so that we really can use it as a learning opportunity for our students and for our instructors, but also keep track of, in an easy way, keep track of academic integrity violations. So if there's a trend or repeated violations, we can really talk to the student about why that is inappropriate and what the next steps might be. And we can, escalate the response to an academic integrity violation if there are multiple incidences. And so, Starfish really has become such a common tool on our campus, both for undergraduate and graduate students, that it just seems to make sense to use that system that is pretty user-friendly, I think, in my experience.
Yes, I agree. I've found it, like I said, I found it enormously, just helpful to go through. And it took me, unfortunately, I had several violations that I needed to submit from over the summer when I was teaching, and the process for all of them was really quick, which I appreciated, because it's, when you're teaching and doing this sort of thing, also it's a lot, right? So I found that very helpful.
Good.
So just since we're talking about this, I will just say that one of the things that I like to do, especially when I teach English 102, which is English composition, it's often referred to as the first year writing course, even though students don't always take it in their freshman year. But I do, and I'll kind of emphasize this with everyone, that I think it's really important for students to know, yes, we put information about the academic integrity policy in our syllabus. It's one of the required pieces, and I think that that's really important. But I also realize that our students get lots of different syllabi from their instructors, and sometimes they will skip over language that they see appear again and again and again. So one of the things that I've started doing, especially in English composition, but in other classes too, especially like over the last couple of years, now that AI is doing what AI does, is spend time showing them what this page looks like, talking them through the different kinds of academic dishonesty, and then also talking them through like what the violations look like. So for many of them, when I show them and click down on these drop downs what an example of a level 0 violation might be, that's very helpful for them, because it really breaks down what they are, what could, so like for example, in English 102, they're learning how to cite. Sometimes they learn how to do this in high school, but depending on what high school they come from, they may have never had to do this before. So explaining to them, and they get really nervous when you talk about plagiarism, and when you talk about, okay, anything that you take word for word needs to have quotation marks around it. That's very important. So when they submit something like that for a grade, and let's say they forget one of the quotation marks, they start it, but then they forget to add the one at the end, they get really nervous about that. So I explain to them that, like, listen, especially in a class like this, you're learning. My job is to teach you how to get better at this kind of thing. So if I see an incomplete quotation, I'm going to point it out. I'm going to explain why it's wrong. And then I'm going to give you the opportunity to fix it when you go ahead and you revise your writing assignment. And that, I think, helps them practice sort of, writing at the college level and working on citation, but it also helps alleviate some of that extreme stress that they feel about plagiarizing when they really don't mean to. I think that plagiarizing accidentally is the thing that scares them a whole bunch, But so anyway, my point is, as instructors, I think it's very helpful for us to go through, show our students this, talk about what the different level violations are, and then also talk to them about what the penalties are. And I make sure to tell them, like, look at the variation here. A lot of this is determined by your instructor, right? So you could have to do, the same thing for a level 0 or a level 1, just kind of depending on who your instructor is and what the circumstances are. So this is very helpful for them to see. And I think also it helps ground some of the decisions that they might make as the semester continues if you are upfront about sharing this information with them. John, do you have anything to add from your perspective?
No, this sounds pretty good.
Okay.
I
Does
think this is great information, Stephanie. Thank you for sharing this. And I didn't know this detail exists, so that's why every day is learning. But yeah, so in the beginning, it's saying like specifically not using AI, or you can use in my class, for example, health promotion program planning class, they can use ideas, get some ideas from AI, but you're not gonna copy to create health promotion program. But it's kind of, how much can I clear about that? It's always challenging.
That's a great question. That's a great point, and that's something that we're going to talk about a little bit more as we kind of keep going. But really, and we have actually a case study that we're going to talk about in just a little bit that kind of talks about, okay, how am I clear with my students about how much is okay and what's not okay? So if it's okay with you, we're going to kind of like hold on to that for now, and then we'll come back to it in just a moment.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah, excellent. I'm glad that this is helpful. I really like to show this page to my students. I think it's very helpful for them to know and for them to see it all written out instead of just listening to me kind of generally talk about it. Just as sort of like a funny side note, whenever I pull up the home page here and I ask them who this is, like on the picture, usually they guess Abraham Lincoln is what they usually say, which I'm tickled by. Yeah.
The founder.
Yeah. All right, so those are our academic integrity policies. And then I do want to show this briefly. So we have a page on our website that is dedicated to artificial intelligence and has a whole bunch of information on it. This has been something that Sean Moriarty and CTS has really worked on building. John and I have also done quite a bit of work related to this space, as well as some other people on campus. So there's a lot of nice resources here. Right at the top, you'll see some information about the AI symposium that we ran for the first time on our campus this past May, which I thought went very well. We had great participation. We talk about the president's vision for us to be an AI-enabled campus and what that looks like. So this is a helpful resource as well. And then the thing that I like about this page is that it cites a whole bunch of other pages that are also very helpful. So many of these are embedded within my presentation. So like CELT's resources page is there, which I'll highlight in just a moment. The Penfield Library AI page is also there. And then we also have some AI best practices and guidelines. There are also some different projects that are happening on campus as well that are related to AI, which I will speak about more in just a little bit. So I will click on this one with the best practices. I think that this is helpful as you are thinking about not only AI in your courses, but also like your own personal use of AI if you are using it. So thinking about things like data privacy, thinking about ethical considerations, thinking about the accuracy of the output, security, and things like that. So this is a helpful resource as well. So there's lots of good information in this page. This page is one that I like to share with my students. So the previous page I find very helpful for faculty and staff. I like to share Penfield's page with my students because it's got a lot of good information for them, especially like if we're thinking about AI and how we're using it in our classroom, the page on how to cite AI. So I like this very much. It's very student forward, you know, like what you should do, should you ask your instructor, some different tips for citation. And then I love that the librarians have also broken this down and show us how we can cite AI in the major citation styles that we use at Oswego. So MLA, APA, and Chicago. And then if you are writing in another style, there's information here too. So this is helpful to share with your students, especially if there is a little bit of that gray area, like how much do I want them to use it? One of the things that I found to be helpful is if you're kind of in the middle and saying, yes, you can use it sometimes, but not all the time, encouraging them to cite their usage, I think helps build in some of that accountability. But we'll talk more about this as we keep going.
One other thing that a lot of people are suggesting is that, and if you're not going to do formal citations, you can have students share their prompts and the results. So that way you're evaluating the process of getting to the final product, whatever that is, depending on the discipline.
I'm actually doing a version of this in class today. So I'm doing sort of like an introductory, like AI talk with my students in English 102. And one of the things I'm going to do is I'm giving them a list of prompts. There's 10 of them. And I'm going to have them have a series of exchanges with ChatGPT, and then I'm basically going to evaluate them based on the quality of their exchanges. So I'm going to encourage them to have like 10 exchanges with ChatGPT, and I'm going to look at what sorts of questions they ask, how they engage with the tool, if they just respond with like a one-word answer or something like that. And then when they're all done, they're going to share the transcript with me, and then they're going to have to reflect on like what the experience was like. So that's a very informal example, but John's suggestion is really wonderful too, that if they're using it to help them with a bigger project that is graded more heavily, have them share that transcript with you so that you can see what they're doing. Okay, and there's other information on here too. I don't want to take too long on this because I want to make sure we have time to chat. And then here's John.
And it needs to be updated.
So I linked the resources page. John has like a whole bunch of information on here, but there are like, we love John because he records all of the workshops that he does, and then they're all organized on here. So there's a whole bunch of information on here connected to AI. John, do you want to point out anything in particular?
If you go to the best practices in learning and teaching, there is an AI site there. And it does link directly to some of the, there we go, AI in college teaching. And it does link directly to some of the past videos, although that does have to be updated. And we will put in links to the symposium. I'll put links into the symposium, as well as one we did at SUNY the year before too.
Great.
And that may already be in there.
So there is some stuff in here as well connected to, like John and I had done several workshops on, like sample syllabus statements and things like that. At this point too, there's a whole bunch of resources that are about like making a syllabus statement. And we'll kind of talk generally about that in just a little bit. But John has some wonderful examples that are linked here as well, if you are looking for examples of syllabus statements that might be helpful.
And you can also ask AI to generate one for you.
It's true. Yes. All right. Does anybody have any questions about any of the resources that are linked here at this time before we move on and make these guys bigger so I can see? There you are. Okay, great. So I like to highlight our own resources, but then this is just a couple. I'm not going to click through these like I did with the ones on our campus. You'll have access to the slides, so you can look through and see, the Fact2 guide. This is something that SUNY worked on that you can check out. So there were 2 editions of this guide. The first one came out in 22, and then the second one came out in 23. 23, or maybe the first one came out in 23
23 and 24.
and 24, something like that. But the updated guide is relatively updated. This is an initiative through Fact2 that John and I both worked on.
And there will be a third edition at some point.
At
soon.
some point, yes. So Fact2, it stands for the Faculty Advisory Council on Teaching and Technology.
Yes.
Yes. And that's a SUNY initiative. And then there's a whole bunch of information that Harvard has put out, and then I linked also something from Cornell. So there are a whole bunch of resources out there beyond these, but I didn't want this to turn into just like one giant pile of like links. So here are just a few. Okay, so as we're thinking about these are the most common approaches to handling AI and academic integrity that I have seen so far. I'm sure there are many others that fall into a whole bunch of gray areas, and John might have some more as well that he would like to add. But I wanted to highlight, these are, what I have seen at this point. We're basically looking at 3 different kinds of classrooms, or 3 different kinds of assignments within one classroom, or a whole bunch of possibilities depending on what the rules are with that particular assignment or that particular faculty member. So there's a whole bunch of wiggle room here. I want to just mention that several years ago, something that I started doing for assignments in my classes, where AI tools are allowed to some extent, is I will make an assignment sheet, and then at the bottom of it, I will put something that I'm calling a note on AI use. And then I will explicitly describe how AI tools can or should not be used to complete the assignment that my students are working on. I got a lot of positive feedback on that from my students and started sharing it. And then now, like many people, right, are doing similar things. I think that if you find yourself in a situation where AI is okay sometimes, but not all the time, putting those explicit instructions on each assignment sheet that you pass out can be very, very helpful and provide guidance for students so they understand what's okay, but what's not okay. And then I will explicitly say also, right, using AI to complete the entire assignment will result in a failing grade, right? So I will be very explicit about, yes, you can use it to help you, but I don't want you to use it to do the entire thing. And here's why. And let's talk about that. I also like to structure all of my assignments using the TILT framework, which John and I talked about a lot over the spring breakouts this year. It was funny. It was a big theme. So if we're thinking about transparency in learning and teaching, and structuring your assignments in a particular format so that your students understand what the purpose of the assignment is right up front, that helps them say like, oh, okay, she's asking me to do this because it's going to help me build this skill. It's going to help me get better at critical thinking. It's going to help me get better at summarizing, right? Or whatever the skill might be. So I'll encourage you, like, if you find yourself kind of in the middle, include some AI guidance on each assignment, but then also design your assignment so that your students understand what their purpose is, which might help them be motivated to do more of the work themselves instead of offloading some of the work to an AI tool. John, would you have anything to add here?
One of the things, yeah, I agree with everything you said.
Yeah.
And one strategy, though, that people will often use is that they will prohibit the use of AI while people are doing some basic skill development. But once they've mastered those skills, then they allow progressively more use of AI. There's an example of that from Dave Gadou in today's Tea for Teaching podcast, where he had initially banned the use of AI 2 years ago in his programming classes, but then he was talking to a programmer, and the programmer said, I don't care how people get the programs together as long as they work and as long as they've been debugged and so forth. So then he went to an extreme position of allowing students to do AI for everything. But then he got halfway through the semester and people were having trouble with one particular aspect of the program that AI wasn't generating the code for. And he said, well, you just use a loop here. And then all the students said, well, what is a loop? Which is kind of a fundamental concept in programming. So he's moved to now prohibiting the use of AI initially as they develop the skills, but then once they've gotten past that, allowing more use so that they can move more rapidly to higher level concepts and applications. And that may be appropriate in the discipline, but we don't want to completely ignore basic skill development, but we do want students to be prepared for a world where they will have access to these tools as well.
Now, that's a really great suggestion. I can see, in teacher education, for example, for lesson planning, right? A lot of teachers might use AI to plan a lesson or a unit, but if we make sure that students know how to plan a lesson first, and then we say, well, if you're going to use some supportive tools, you can evaluate that lesson that's generated by an outside source. So I love that progressive use of AI. That's a great suggestion. Thanks.
I really like that approach also. And one of the things that we talk about in writing classes, right, is like, if you don't know how to do this one thing, how are you going to know if AI is doing it well or not? Like, you're not going to know, right? Because it's just going to spit out what it's going to spit out. And you can either accept it or you can question it. So there's a lot that's being done also for evaluating AI tools, like you were mentioning, and thinking about, okay, now you know how to do this thing. Now let's see how well AI does it. So it's a wonderful method.
Yeah, I think that's great guideline, especially the professors knows, when they should use AI, when should stop it. Those guidelines, giving them the professor's roles. And I think that's great, especially Stephanie, you mentioned about each assignment, what's acceptable in terms of AI, what's not, specifying it. I haven't thought about it. I put it in the syllabus and in general, generic, so you can use opinion, etc. But be specific to each assignment, gives them idea about what student can use it, what they shouldn't. So I try to, especially in my class, in-person class, I try to be interactive in the classroom. So try not, so they using ideas from AI is fine in the classroom. I give them, find a solution for certain things or ideas and search for it now. And then they give ideas, etc. But I said certain things you shouldn't use. I be specific. But in online class, it's kind of challenging to know, how much they're using it, how much they're not using. It's really hard to grade, especially grade in terms of grading. It's very difficult. So any suggestions for, I got an idea from Stephanie that using specific guideline for each assignment, even online courses, I think that's the first step to do. What else could you suggest for online courses?
That's a great
I
question.
stopped teaching online because of this issue, because everything I was getting was, or 95% of it was generated by AI. But this is something that people are going to have to come up with ways of doing. One is to integrate AI into the assignments more effectively. That just didn't work well in the courses I was teaching. But
you bring up a really good point, and the online teaching thing is a beast that I have not been teaching online, but I understand, like, so for example, one thing that I did when I was teaching over the summer is that I did give my students a discussion board assignment, and I made sure, but again, like, this is an in-person class with an online component, but I made sure to talk to them about the importance of, making sure that your discussion board posts do not sound like they have been vaguely generated by an AI tool, right? And it's interesting because our students are using AI, but many of them are still not using it very well. So it does tend to be quite obvious when something has been generated. But we made sure to really talk about, the importance of not generating something from AI, because the whole purpose of a discussion board is for people to talk to each other. And if you make a post that no one has anything to say anything about, is it a good post, right? Like, if no one can really respond or offer anything to add on, how good is this post? So I designed prompts that try to encourage them to include their own opinion, to ask questions, to tell us an anecdote, a short story, as a way to start to teach them how to do those things. I think that John and I could think more about the online teaching piece and try to pull together some more resources for you, because unfortunately it's not something that I have experience doing.
It's something I had done for decades, but it
Yeah.
has become more challenging. But the best thing to do is to use a tilt approach, remind students that they're learning some basic skills here that will be useful elsewhere, and therefore it is important that they actually do the work themselves. But to the extent to which you can build AI into the assignments themselves so that they have some guidelines on where it can be used and where it's inappropriate to use, that may be helpful. One thing that the California university system has done is they've moved to a much larger share of proctored exams across the whole system, but you can take them at any site, any of the institutions there. So they have proctoring centers for their online classes where you can go to whichever campus is closest and do proctored exams there. That's not happening here, at least not in the near future, but that is one sort of solution that perhaps some systems may move to.
Thank you. Integrated AI integrated assignment use. I think I haven't thought about that for online courses, but I think that's a great idea. I'd like to try that.
We'll talk a little bit more as we keep going, and I'll mention an opportunity that you might be interested in that's connected to a grant that John and I are both working on. So stay tuned, because if you are interested in redesigning an assignment, we'll talk to you about that in just a minute. All right. Okay, so we know what many of these are, and I want to get to the case studies because they're going to be way more fun. So here are some of the challenges. So we're going to kind of like generally talk about some of this stuff. Okay, so what we're going to do, because all the four of us are a small group, so we're going to do this together. But what I have are a couple of scenarios, and I want us to think about what would you do as the instructor in this situation, and then what strategies could we discuss that could either reduce confusion on the student's end, reduce conflict for anyone, or maybe just be a nice way to kind of like approach the scenario if this happens to you. So let's do the first one. So this is one that happens to me frequently. So you receive a research paper from a student who has struggled with writing all semester. This draft is polished, well organized, and sounds different from other work they have previously submitted. You suspect that they used AI to generate their draft. What do you do? So since this has happened to me like a bunch, I'm going to try to hold off on saying things because I'm curious what others might say.
I had this kind of situation before, so I personally asked the student, did you use AI? And the student said, no, I didn't. So I just saying nicely, AI just completely using AI. You shouldn't do that in the future. Directly did that. So after that, the student, the paper was different. It wasn't like the AI completely used paper. So
do you ask them in person, or do you ask them
in person? Yes,
in person. Why do you do it in person?
Because it was so obvious to me. It was like AI. To me, it was completely AI used paper. So to avoid that student to do it again, so I had to confront personally, directly, instead of just like doing it
online classes,
as a group. Yeah, online course. Yeah, it was one of online students. So I don't know. That's the best approach. I'm glad you guys are doing this.
I think it's hard because I think when you say to, when you come out to somebody and say, I mean, my instinct to say, did you use AI? Like to just, let's go cut right to the chase. But I think another way to think about it might be to say, like, I read your paper. Tell me how you wrote this paper. Tell me how you came up with this paper. Tell me how you came up with these ideas. And then that almost is a safer place for a student to sort of talk about their process, and maybe they'll say, oh, like, I mean, this is dating myself, but it's like when Wikipedia first came out, right? So we would say to students, you know, tell me how you got some ideas for this. And through that discussion, they'd say, well, I looked at Google, did a Google search, or I looked at Wikipedia, and that gave me some ideas, and then I started here. So I think that's also a learning opportunity to say, well, okay, you started someplace, but you didn't do that next step of making it your own, right? So, or if the AI is completely not allowed in the class, to say, you know, that's against what the policy is in our course, or that's against, you know, what I wanted you to do for this assignment, or inappropriate use or whatever, and either redo the assignment, or instead I'll give you an opportunity to talk through the points you were making, your main thesis of this paper, you know, like try to do so. I mean, I struggle with honestly making a student then talk about their paper that they wrote, because I think in some ways that sometimes I write a paper and a week after I turn it in, I don't necessarily remember all the details of the paper. But also, I think it also is hard for students who aren't really articulate, right? Who have a hard time expressing their ideas fully when they're talking. So I struggle with this too. I mean, I'm with you, Minjung. I think it's a tough thing when you know there's a difference in this writing, but how do you help the student understand that what they did was, they probably understand that was inappropriate, but how that's not going to be accepted, and what the markers were for you? I think it's a tough question.
I think it's a really hard question, and so I am like a non-confrontational person just by nature. I hate having hard conversations with people. And so when this started becoming like and obviously, like, I had conversations before with students who had been dishonest, right? But those are like way easier, because all you'd have to do is kind of do a little bit of research and then find where the direct quote came from that they didn't write. And then you couldn't be like, hey, look, here it is, like, here it is here, and here it is in your paper, but in your paper it's not cited, you know? So that seemed easier.
It used to be easier.
To be easier, yeah. So basically, like, I have a similar approach to what Carol was describing. But also, like, I do think that it's important to try to have this conversation face to face. So, you know, if you're teaching online, then like over Zoom, I think is fine. Or, you know, if you're teaching in person, try to have it in person, but also in a private place. So this is a conversation that I would generally try to have in my office, not in the hallway, not at the end of class, right? But basically just, you know, say, hey, like, I just have some questions about the paper that you submitted. Can you talk me through your process? I'd like to know how you made this, but you know, what you did to kind of work your way through this. And I'm already kind of stumbling over my words, because just the thought of having this conversation makes me want to throw up. But like, so I'll ask them to describe their process. And then usually what happens is they start to kind of fumble a little bit here. So I'll say, well, you know, the reason I'm asking you about this is because, you know, I've gotten to know your writing a little bit over the last insert length of time here. You know, I've gotten to know your writing a little bit, and the tone of what you've written here and the way your words are arranged in the sentences is quite a bit different from the other things that you've submitted so far. Can you tell me why that is? I'd like to know why this is different, so much so, from the other stuff. And usually at that point, we will start to make some progress. And they'll either tell me, like, I used AI to do it, I used AI to help. Sometimes they won't, and then it gets more uncomfortable. And then I just flat out say, I really value honesty and transparency in my classroom, so I'm going to be honest with you, and I have real suspicions that this is not something that you authentically made. Please be honest with me, and then we can both move forward together, and I'll give you the opportunity to redo this assignment if it isn't something that you made yourself. Usually at that point, we'll have some sort of miniature breakthrough. When I say I'll give you the opportunity to do it again, but we haven't always. You know, there have been a couple of times where students are just basically like, nope, I did it. I did the whole thing. I did it all by myself. And I'm like, okay, you know. But that kind of raises that red flag. And then I really hate that when that happens, because then moving forward, I suspect everything that they submit for the rest of the semester was not authentically theirs. So it's really a rotten thing to happen.
Yeah, I think meeting through Zoom and ask that I love your suggestion and do it. And I think that's a fantastic idea. That's the best way approach to it. And I was wondering, can we have like oral present the discussion portion
Sure.
on online classes? Can we do that?
You can, and people have.
I
Sure.
haven't tried yet because it's asynchronous course. It's we can't require that, but we can have some kind of assignment of making a video and submit it instead of writing.
And videos can easily be generated by AI. In fact, we've done some workshops on that where they can record themselves and then have AI generate a script, and then it would appear as if they're presenting that script in their own voice and tone. But
And
yeah.
Joe, what do you mean we can't do that in an asynchronous class? You can't do what? Have a conversation with a student?
No, not a conversation.
Like a face-to-face oral exam?
Yes. Can we?
People do. I don't know if many people here do, but I know it's not an uncommon practice, and it's one of the ways that people have been addressing AI issues.
Yeah, I think as
It's
long
asynchronous course. Can we require on a couple of assignment as an oral assignment instead of writing?
Yes.
Okay.
The answer, I believe the answer to that is yes. I think the key would be is if you give choice in when that student can schedule that
Right.
conversation, that oral exam, so that you can accommodate their schedule.
Yeah. Okay.
But I think,
Yeah.
and especially if you have a question around a piece of work that they've done, and you want to say, okay, well, as a follow-up, we're going to do, some of you I'm going to ask to speak with me one-on-one to talk to me about your paper or whatever, then I think you absolutely can do that in an asynchronous class.
So
Just that
test
in an
as well, like quizzes or exam, also oral exam. You're talking. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah,
A common practice is to do that for a final, where you just break the time up into small chunks and you schedule it with the students, because that's the time when they normally be scheduled for that. Well, again, if it's synchronous. If it's asynchronous, you'd have to give them lots of time options, because students often take asynchronous courses because they're working during the day, or they're doing swing shifts, or they're they're traveling, or whatever.
or they're in a different time zone, right? So
Right.
I think, but asynchronous just means the bulk of the content is done independently. It doesn't mean that there's no contact. In fact, it should be the opposite. There should be sure that there is contact with the professor.
Yeah. So I offer Zoom meetings. That's different from giving assignment and giving the test orally. So
Yeah, I think you could give a test or a quiz if students have the opportunity to schedule the time.
all right. Thank you. I'd like to add that.
Yeah, the only challenge with that is it doesn't scale well. So that can work if you have 20, 30 students. It may not work. Most of my online classes were 50 students or more, which would be difficult to do oral exams with.
that's true.
We can talk, Min Jung, about some ways that you might be able to, I can think of some ideas and ways you might be able to do that if you have a large class too, some partner work or something, but we can talk about that at another time and offline.
Well, and I did have
Yeah,
students
sure.
create
Yeah, so I
Python.
have a max 20 students and my bachelor's classes, graduate classes, and senior classes. So
Mhm.
yeah, I don't want to. I like the balance between online because we have online majors and graduate undergraduate courses, and a lot of my courses are interactive in person. There's a lot of interaction in the classroom. I try to balance out in my online courses as well. So trying to make more interactive, not using AI a lot. So that's my focus. That's why I'm here too.
All right, great. Let's do one other one and then we will wrap up. So, what do we think? Do we want to do this one? This one's interesting, but it's another essays one. So let's skip this so that we can do something else. Okay. During a group project, a student admits they relied on AI to write much of their section. Other group members feel this is unfair and want you, the instructor, to do something about it. What do you do in this situation? I think this question is interesting because group work already has such a fascinating dynamic, right? In different classes or group projects do. So this really adds, I think, a whole nother layer.
And adding
to
one other
that.
layer is going back to the transparency issue.
Right.
What sort of policies are established in the course will affect how this is addressed too.
That's a good point.
Arg. This is a tough one.
Yeah.
You know, I think I would say to the group members, what would you expect me to do? And they would, you know, whatever they would say, I'm like, well, go ahead. You're a group, do it. You know what I mean? I guess I would try to give them some of that responsibility back. This is a tough one. How come there's not easy scenarios, Stephanie? That's
And the easy ones are easy. One thing that Kristen Croyle has done in workshops where she's talked about small groups. This is mostly synchronous, not asynchronous. But she suggested that if you have persistent groups, to periodically have the groups meet. If they're meeting in class, give them some time in class where they resolve such issues among themselves and work it out, so that they bring up any concerns they have and they address them. And also at the start of the group that they put together an agreement of what the guidelines are, what the boundaries are, and so forth. So some of this could be avoided by perhaps addressing some of these issues initially. And you can ask, if you have guidelines that allow it to be used or not allow it to be used, you can ask them how they might address challenges like this. Let the groups themselves address this at the start of the semester, perhaps, and then meet periodically to resolve issues as they come. And that's eliminated so many of the problems I used to have I have groups that last through the entire semester. The problems, 95% of the problems disappear when they have group processing time.
That's a great suggestion. Connected to that, which I know this is something that John has done, and I tried it for the first time this summer, is a different kind of group work. But I put the students in groups and then I said, okay, here's the assignment. This is the ultimate goal. So what I want you all to do is work together to come up with the guidelines, right? Like you make so I had them make, they didn't make the whole thing, but they basically decided like how they wanted to be evaluated. So I said, okay, like you decide what is most important to you. And then you're going to have input on that. And then we're all going to work together to kind of come up with these common guidelines, but it's going to be created basically by you. And that gives them a lot more autonomy as well to kind of say like, this is valuable to me. This is really important. So I want to focus on this because, and actually the process of doing that was a really cool learning opportunity for them because they had never had control over how they would be evaluated. So I think that it was a challenging thing for them to do because these were incoming freshman students, but I think ultimately it was worthwhile for them to have control over how they would be graded. So maybe doing something like that, as well as what John was talking about, could be a helpful way to sort of handle when this kind of stuff comes up.
So Stephanie, just so you sort of tell the purpose is, this is why you're doing this assignment. This is the end goal I want to see. You tell me how I should evaluate your group's work.
Yep.
And show me what evidence are you going to provide that you've reached this goal.
Yep.
Okay.
So one of the things that we did was I gave them the NACE competencies and said like, hey, here's what, colleges and businesses and employers are looking for. They're looking for these skills. There's like 8 of them, right? It's thinking about your critical thinking ability, your oral and written communication, your time management stuff, right? Like all of these sort of like key project skills that employers are looking for and have deemed valuable. So we talked about what all of those skills were. And then I said, thinking about these competencies, right? Like, let's think about how they might impact how you are evaluated. Like, how do you want to work together as a group with this in mind, with these skills in mind? So the purpose of this is to start building these skills for you with this assignment.
And you
So
can,
what course did you use it?
It was kind of like an introductory writing class for incoming freshman students this summer. So I teach in the Educational Opportunity Program, or EOP, and it was an assignment that we did in that class.
Were that students smart enough to create the evaluation?
Yeah. They seemed to really like, especially because they were all right coming from high school. So they seemed to really like the opportunity to evaluate them, to have a say in it.
Yeah. In this scenario, if I put my 2 cents, as Stefan, you talked about detailed guideline for using AI for certain things, not used for certain things. I think specifying it might help to solve this situation so that the students do not rely heavily on AI use.
I agree. I think that would be key here, actually, to make sure that before they even get started, they have guidance. So it would be really easy, like we talked about, to say, listen, this was in the initial assignment sheet. So like, that this is something that you're not supposed to do, rely too much on AI to write this section, if that's in the assignment sheet. So you could always refer back to that. And, that would help that transparency also with the students in the group, but also with the one problem student.
And you can also have the class come up with, even in online classes, have them come up with some AI policies, again, because supporting student autonomy can be really helpful in getting more buy-in into those policies.
So I have to be mindful of everybody's time, and I have to teach at 10:20. So, okay, I'm just gonna go through here to the end. So there's more ideas here. I will recommend Danny Liu from the University of Sydney, or at Sydney. He has a lot of really wonderful, innovative AI and education information, and he might have some good online teaching suggestions. So definitely check him out. Do you have any other copies of The Opposite of Cheating?
We have 2 more left.
Okay.
So if we can add 2 more people.
Okay. So John is doing the reading groups this semester, and The Opposite of Cheating looks like a really, really good read. And that's thinking about AI and, like evaluation and pretty much everything that we were kind of talking about today. So get in touch with John if you would like a copy of that book. And then I will say very briefly, John has sent out a couple of announcements about this so far, but we would be like, I could forward one if you would be interested, Menjung. So like this year, John and I are participating in another IITG, which is an Innovative Instruction and Technology grant. It's basically an opportunity for you to get a $500 stipend by choosing a group of SUNY faculty to join to learn more about AI and higher education. So there are 5 different groups that you could potentially join. John is doing one on developing chatbots. I'm doing one on AI and accessibility. We have one, though, that talks about AI and redesigning an assignment that you might use in your class, which I think is one that you might really like since you were talking about it. There's an AI and writing one, and then also an AI and assessment group. So applications are open for that until September 19th. So if you are interested, just let John or I know, and we can send you the information and you can apply. It's a nice opportunity. It will run from October through May. And you'll basically meet once a month and work on whatever group you decide that you would want to join.
I'm very interested in that. Yes, please send me the information.
Yeah, we will. We'll make sure to do that.
Announcement out too, just.
Okay, great. Yeah, so that's a wonderful opportunity as well for you to get some more hands-on stuff. I'm really excited to work on this again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you both.
I'm glad I'm here today.
Us too. Do you guys have any final questions before we wrap up?
Could you share the PowerPoint slide with me?
Sure, yes, I will email it to you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Great, thank you so much.
thank you both.
Thank you.
Have a
Thank you.
wonderful
Have
day.
a good day.
Okay, let me find my mouse,
And then,
stop the share,
and
stop the recording. Stop recording.